Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, an exploration of strategy, leadership, technology, and entrepreneurship. Your host, Nectar, is the co-founder and partner at the PNR, a strategy consulting firm based in Montreal.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, the show where we interview presidents, CEOs, and industry leaders to talk about how they think about strategy. On today's show, I spoke with Brie Code, CEO and Creative Director at Tru Luv. I was lucky enough to meet Brie because of a referral, thanks to Evan. And Brie is a former Montrealer. She's CEO of a company called Tru Luv. It's a Toronto-based studio that makes AI companions that are built on a framework of deepening friendship. Essentially the opposite of what the big mega platforms are trying to do with their engagement-based model. She's gone into gaming earlier in her career. We spoke about her journey of self-discovery and finding her next move after working for a really big gaming studio. We spoke about this concept of tending and befriending, the ocean of psychological growth. Brie is this really special person. She has this unique philosophy and approach in her startup. She's also a great entrepreneur, and it really feels like she's just getting started. I was really blown away by this conversation, and I really hope that you enjoy our discussion. Thank you. So first question, Brie, I'd like to ask you is, after having spent many years in the video game industry, do you love or hate games?
After many years in the video game industry, I have a lot of hopes and dreams for games in directions that we aren't necessarily going. I don't play many games anymore because I just know too deeply how they're made. And so the illusion doesn't work on me. I think the game that I spend the most time playing these days is Rosetta Stone, which is a language learning app.
And you call that a game?
Yeah, it's perfectly gamified, and it's perfect, the curve, they teach you really fast.
Yeah. Maybe one geek question would be what was your favorite game when you were maybe more of a hardcore gamer?
My favorite game of all time is a game called Morrowind.
Okay, never heard of it.
It came out right after I finished university or around that time. It was a precursor to a big game that is more recent called Skyrim. Morrowind is like a huge, sprawling, open world RPG, and just the characters in the world were really fantastic. And that game came out at a time when I was going through a little life crisis because I had my computer science degree and I wasn't sure if I wanted to actually be a programmer. And I kind of played that video game a lot, and while playing it, I can see, looking back now, that what I did while playing it was figure out what kind of adult I wanted to be. So that it was a transformative game for me.
Yeah. And how did you get into computer science? You grew up in Vancouver, out west. Yeah. So computer science was not it's not a hub. It's not known as being a hub of computer science, at least back then. So curious how you stumbled into that field. Was it preordained, or was it something you just kind of
my last name is Code. And so I guess people are attracted to careers that are similar to their last names. My dad was a programmer. And so we had a computer before anyone else had a computer. I was programming on a Commodore 64 when I was 6 or something. I was programming in BASIC on a Pentium by the time I was 9. And when I went to university, I wanted to study psychology, but I was also on a full scholarship that I needed 86 average to keep. And I found psychology a little bit too subjective to make sure that I would be able to keep that average. And I needed to, I didn't have savings. So I did computer science because you can just stay in the lab until your program works and you'll get an A.
Yeah. And then from there, how did you stumble into video games? I know that one of the first, you worked for Rebel, I believe?
Relic,
yeah. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. So I graduated and I kept a programming job at the university because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was thinking about becoming a dentist. I'm not sure why. And my childhood dream had been to be a trucker, which wasn't something I was considering anymore at that time. And then, so at a certain point, I just realized I could get a credit card, and I got one and went to Europe. And I thought I would take like a year and try to figure out like what I really wanted to do. I graduated from university when I was 20. So I was just too young. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. And, then all that happened in Europe was I ran out of money. And then I came home with like $8 left on the card and started applying for programming jobs because I was like, I just need a job. And it had never occurred to me that video games could be something you could do. There weren't game design programs in schools back then. And I had loved video games growing up because we had a PC from, when I was so young. So then one of the places I applied was Relic, and they make a beautiful game, or made at the time, called Homeworld, which was just a gorgeous game, and I was a big fan of it. And then luckily, so it was just timing that when I was looking for a job, they were also looking for their first 2 juniors. And I was, I think, the first person in general to ace their programming test. And so I got one of those like coveted 2 junior spots. And I remember the interview was so grueling, and I went home and cried afterward. I didn't realize that like if someone gruels you for 3 hours, it's because they're actually interested and not that they're just trying to be mean. So I was really surprised when I got offered the job, and then I never looked back. I really loved working there.
Yeah. And when did you realize like, okay, there's this intersection of I'm good at it and I want to stay because I'm performing well?
Yeah. So the first, I told them in the interview that my plan was to go back to school, and do something else. But I think it was like the first year there, I really liked the team. They were really professional and kind and collaborative. And the work was just really interesting. Like at the time, game engines didn't exist. So we had to kind of write our own engine. And so I was working on, building up this game engine with the whole team. And then we built the AI on top of that. And I wrote the AI for Company of Heroes with my colleague Shelby. And I really liked working on that. It was just like, we're coming up with data structures and algorithms completely like just based on the needs of what we need to do and not based on anyone else's previous work. So that was really fun.
So you felt like you're innovating, you're creating something new that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And you also grew up is not the right term, but like your career started accelerating during a time where video games were evolving very rapidly.
Yeah.
Right. And, you were doing AI with, air quotes before it was even a thing where people knew what it was.
Yeah.
And, so curious to hear you about how that happened. And, obviously, video games have progressed a lot during that time.
Yeah. So, that was a very exciting time. Company of Heroes was the first RTS game to have squad level AI. And so I helped work on that. And that kind of has created a lifelong interest in, algorithms to help AI coordinate or connect. So, eventually I moved to Ubisoft in Montreal, and I also worked on, what was called crowd AI and group AI. This kind of layer in the AI engine was always my focus, moving up to now my company focusing on companion AI.
Yeah. And while you're at Ubisoft, so like, I think you spent 7 years there, if I'm not mistaken, or is it something like that?
7 years.
You worked on some of these, global franchises like Assassin's Creed.
Yeah.
So we could talk a little bit about that. We're curious as to like, why did you decide to leave? Like, you had success, you had like you're a leader in the company. So curious as to what the thought process behind leaving, a pretty safe, with air quotes, job.
Yeah, I loved working at Ubisoft. The challenges were big, the teams were big and ran like clockwork. So it was kind of like being part of something greater than yourself. But while I was there, I kind of had a series of realizations about the core of game design theory and things that I wanted to change. So, I realized while I was there that none of my friends play video games and they're just not interested in them. And that the conception of my colleagues was that people who don't play video games, they are just kind of like not good enough. Like they're not good enough at the game. They don't get it. They can't do it. And that's why they wouldn't play. But like none of my friends are just even interested. Like they look at it and they're just, that's not something that would engage them. And I was very interested in why. And I started to read everything I could about player psychology. And from there, I kind of got into stress psychology. And one of the core tenets of game design theory is that we kind of create what's called a psychological flow state in the player. And a flow state is where you kind of get really absorbed in something, you lose track of time, you're deeply interested. I get into flow states when I'm programming, for example. And the theory from psychology of how to get into a flow state is basically like through an increasing challenge curve. And this is the game design curve. We create things that go from easy to hard. And it's so we kind of get progressively harder and harder and harder until you die. And the feelings involved in this are feelings of, adrenaline, like the challenge that the game designer is presenting stimulates your fight or flight response to stress and releases adrenaline in your system, which makes you instinctively want to win something. And then the game designer gives you a challenge to win, and you win it and you feel good. And we kind of keep you in a channel of like challenge, reward, challenge, reward, challenge, reward that's ever increasing. But what I discovered, I thought about this, that has never been what has engaged me about video games. I'm interested in the characters. I'm interested in the story. I'm interested in like creation and tending behaviors, like looking after the base that I'm building. And I don't really care so much for the attacky parts. And there is another human stress response that is little known and probably wasn't considered in the original work around the theory of flow and wasn't considered in the original work around human stress response, where, when I was in school, I learned that the stress response is fight or flight. But there's another one, which is called tend and befriend. And this is the stress response that more feminine people tend to have. People can have either stress response, different ones at different times. You can also kind of train yourself over time as to which stress response you have, based on mindset and practice. And the tend and befriend response, instead of wanting to win, it's not adrenaline involved, it's oxytocin. And oxytocin is the hormone that makes you want to take care of things, connect with your loved ones, and find solutions that work for everyone. And this is how I respond to stress. And I thought, this explains all of my friends who aren't interested in video games. This is what their personalities are like also. And so I know that basically what I was positing is that game design is wrong for half of people, that game design might actually be encouraging us to respond with a fight or flight response more often, which is probably not something we want. And that innovation happens outside of established structures, and the best place to do experimental or innovative work is in a startup. So I left to go explore that concept. Yeah,
there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, Brie, and there's a few different areas. And maybe one quick question, and I want to go back to a few points you mentioned, but I think the statistics show that video gamers are mostly male.
Yes.
Today.
Yeah.
I think 80 or 85% to some large majority.
If you count mobile games, I think it's 50-50. The statistics I've seen is it's around 50-50, but I mean, if you talk to people in the street, you can see that the people who tend to like the big action games tend to be men.
Yeah. Or in terms of hours spent or dollars, like, like share of wallet, like it's still predominantly male. And the interesting point I just realized is like, well, it's very kind of like the hormone that you're going after is dopamine, right?
Yeah.
So to similar to mobile gaming or even social media, and we can talk about that later, is, well, it's this kind of like reward, carrot stick kind of reward, as you mentioned.
Using stress or challenge or frustration as an engagement mechanic is something that the games industry is focused down on because of the theory of flow, but it's what the advertising world has used for a very long time. It's what we use for action films, basically any film that uses Western narrative structure. And the internet as well. And it's a generally accepted, great, effective form of creating engagement, but also stresses us.
Yeah. And you mentioned oxytocin, which is like the more, let's say, happy benefit, or the less, less stressful related. So that should be part of things like The Sims, for instance, in terms of a game that you're creating. Yeah. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not a video game connoisseur, but it seems like it would be more about creation and nurturing a community versus like, I need to kill the monster and the boss in level 3.
Yes.
And do you think that today that is well understood in the game industry, that there's this other benefit that we can seek?
I wrote an article about it in 2016 that went viral in the industry. I think it had like 10,000 times more hits than any other article on gamesindustry.biz at the time. And the idea has slowly moved through the games industry, but not the thing is that the workforce are people who like games the way they are. Like, that's why they came to work in the games industry. And it's like, especially in creative industry, people don't want to work on products that aren't the thing that they would want to create for themselves. So even though the idea is out there, it's still not really being leveraged.
Yeah, so you saw this deep insatisfaction. Well, deep is maybe too strong a word, but you were unsatisfied with the current state when you were at Ubisoft.
I mean, because as a woman, when I realized that, like, I learned in school that my stress response was different than it was. And then I didn't understand my own experiences in life and tried to make myself fit what I thought was normal, which is just not how I was actually wired. So, like, you know, and then when I realized this, and I realized that, like, my entire industry is built on something that isn't the way that I'm wired, and that then many times through my life, I've been dismissed or ridiculed or just felt wrong, like felt like there was something wrong with me. This was like a very, like, personal realization to come to, that there is another engagement loop, basically, and that we're not using, because the games industry and the tech industry are mostly like kind of one type of man. Yeah.
And during that period of your life, how quickly did you make that decision? And did you seek advice from friends and family, or did you really, like, wake up one Monday morning and, you know, walk into your boss's office and quit? How did that happen?
I took 2 weeks. I quit, and then they asked me to take 2 weeks to think, or 3 weeks, I think, to think about it. And I thought about it, and I hadn't decided when I came back in after the 3 weeks. And then I just heard the words coming out of my mouth. So I quit. And then I went to stay with some friends in Australia and talked about, like, what I wanted to do with the industry. And I didn't know how I would do that. I knew nothing about startups. I didn't even know, like, do I want to do this in Montreal? It didn't seem like the right place for it, because there's such a prevalence of, you know, this one kind of way of thinking about game design. So how would I recruit the right people? And so my friends gave me a typical Australian solution. My friend, like, went to work, and then she came home and she said, I had a vision of your next year. You're going to travel for a year. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Like, I have responsibilities in Montreal. I'm part of the community. Like, I'm in my late 30s. I'm not going to take a year off to travel. And then I went to sleep and I woke up and I thought, no, I'm totally going to do that, because I can build this studio anywhere in the world. And I need to find the right people to create this, like, to explore this. Like, I might actually be wrong. Like, I could be crazy. But I think I might be right about this.
Yeah. And then you settled on, after a year of, you know, exploring the world, you settled on Toronto as a new home base.
Yeah. I ended up traveling for almost 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Because
okay.
while I was traveling, I wrote that article about it and it went viral, and I realized, like, people are receptive to this idea. So I started doing speaking tour, and I did speaking tour for quite a long time, because I found it very inspiring, because every time I spoke about these concepts, a number of, like, basically most of the women in the audience would, like, be very mind blown and touched and come up and talk to me afterward, and they would cry in the talk, and, like, same huge realization that I went through, I was sharing with them. And also that was, like, a great way to start recruiting people for my studio.
Yeah, it's good. Good side benefit.
Yeah.
And so, talk to us about the studios. Talk to us about Tru Luv, and where did the name come from?
Because oxytocin is the love hormone. So, you know, I knew I wanted to explore this other game loop, and so
you put your stake in the ground. You're calling it this. Basically, we're not going to be doing the other type of game design.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, what is Tru Luv today?
Tru Luv is a Toronto-based studio where we make AI companions. AI companions are not a personal assistant, not a game, not an app, but something more like a friend who knows you well and can kind of, you help the companion and the companion helps you on a journey of, like, relaxation and personal growth for resilience.
And so you've built your own apps, right?
We've released one. It was a little test up to see if I was, like, correct or had lost it. And so we created an app called #Selfcare. I co-designed it with Eve Thomas, a magazine editor in Montreal, who knows nothing about video games and who I figured probably had this other stress response, so that I could take off like my blinders from being in the games industry for too long and kind of see through her eyes. And she's amazing to work with. And so we created this app called #Selfcare. And in it, we put a number of different little interactions that take about 3 to 5 minutes to do, that instead of following a curve from easy to hard, they follow different curves that are metaphors for connection. So a curve from like messy to tidy, awkward to smooth, just disconnected to connected. And we released it just to see, like, does this work? And with no advertising, in the first few weeks, we had 500,000 downloads.
Wow. And
we still haven't done any advertising because that's a test app. And it has like 1.6 million downloads the last time I looked.
Wow.
But it's a 3 to 5 minute experience. So like it's not meant to be used over and over again.
Because you're not trying to do the hamster wheel of engagement, right?
No,
like as
exactly.
we're talking about before.
Yeah. And it was just to know, like, does this work? And so the most important thing about the release of that app to me was, that we were flooded with feedback from, our audience. And what they were saying in their emails and reviews was so literally exactly what I would expect to hear if I was right about this other engagement model. Things like, it's like it put me in a trance. It's the most calming app I have. I feel as if the little avatar is looking out for me as much as I'm looking out for them. And, this is a really simple experience, but it does seem to, creating these feelings of care and connection between the audience and the app. And so we learned a lot from that. And now we have, I think we have 129 different interaction curves to replace the easy to hard curve. And we're working on a number of like new things that we'll be releasing in the new year.
Yeah. And how do you plan to make it a sustainable business? Like, how do you plan to monetize it?
Because we're talking about a new interaction model that's built like on care and connection and not manipulation, we have to innovate at every part of the chain, right? Like, so our advertising will need to be different. Our engagement loop is different, and like to create, we don't want to create something that retains people through manipulation either, but actually just helps them on their psychological growth and like creation of healthy habits that are good and nourishing for the audience. And so we work with a group of psychologists in the Netherlands called the Games for Emotional and Mental Health Lab, to make sure that the product is something that is very psychologically healthy. And we're working with the lab to optimize for psychological health rather than for engagement and retention. And so that also means, monetization model that's not manipulative. So that's something we're still experimenting with, and we'll be working. We'll be working with our audience to test out a few different ideas to see what people like feel good about paying, and not trying to back them into a corner and trick them into paying or anything like this.
Yeah. I imagine maybe a subscription or some kind of tiered model that people, because if you're paying for it, right, that's the model, right? Versus like the ad-based model, which is like,
completely.
You don't kind of know how they make money, right? Like a Candy Crush or things like this. And
subscription model is what I'm very interested in. I'm also reading a lot about the psychology of altruism and like looking at potential like very ethical subscription models, maybe where you subscribe for people less privileged than yourself, something like this.
Yeah. That's interesting. Having some kind of ethical component tied directly into the model, right?
Yeah.
You can almost think like a Tom Shoes, right? Where it's like, obviously one particular example, but I'm sure it could be applied in your space as well. You're curious as to, where were you when you found out that Apple selected your app to be one of the trends of 2018?
Right. So after the app came out, and this is a great story, I think. My Apple developer account is tied to an email I don't use. And so I didn't realize Apple had been trying to contact me for months. And then one day in my Tru Luv email, I got this email from Apple that said, like, you've been selected to be an app of the year. And I thought it was a fake email, but I was like, but in CC were all the people I knew at Apple? Like, because I'm in contact, like, so I was like, this is a really good spam email. Like, what scam is this? Like, how did they know who I know at Apple?
Who's this Nigerian prince that knows?
And then I realized, no, I think this is real. So I wrote them back and I was like, oh, like, thank you. And then like, so they needed some assets from me and things like that. So we got those together. And then it was just a few days later, I happened to log into that old email address and then saw all these emails from Apple from the months prior. And I was like, oh, I feel like an idiot.
And what's been the windfall since that announcement? Has it translated into like people wanting to work with you or like more downloads? And...
You know, I think for us, like we're really focused on we're not focused on playing in this thin layer of trying to optimize for, you know, metrics and like A/B testing of just trying to create the most like manipulative experience. We're really focused on trying to create something that resonates and resonates culturally and resonates with like, you know, just the amount of people who are experiencing anxiety now, especially young people, is much worse than it was before. I think it's 28% of young people are experiencing anxiety, and that's who are reporting it, and it's estimated that it's about 40%. And the age that people are taking their first serious stress leave from work is much lower than it was before. I think it's in the 20s now. And so we are really focused on creating something that actually helps people in a very real way. And then, you know, if the accolades come for us, it's just a sign that we're on the right track. And we're not trying to win those accolades, but if they come, it means we're doing something right.
Yeah. Yeah. Without getting into like the business side, but it sounds like it's much more deep as an approach versus like a broad approach. Like you said, you're not trying to optimize for, you know, the click cycle.
Yeah.
But what's your vision for Tru Luv? Like, where do you want to take the company? What do you think is the opportunity that you can go after?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think that what we can create is a new kind of product. Right now, the paradigm for apps is that we generally do engagement through this shock and challenge kind of thing. Apps generally either present you with way too many options and feel stressful because you have to somehow be the expert on this thing that you just downloaded an app about. Like if I download a fitness app, it's because I don't know anything about fitness. And then there's all these options in the app, and then like it's overwhelming for me, and I'm supposed to somehow boss the app around. Or there's apps that like track you and interrupt you and treat you quite abusively and like tell you what you're supposed to be doing. Like notifications are like this. And so then it's kind of like the app is your boss. And I would really like to see a paradigm where the way that we interface with technology is as if technology was a friend, that we're on the same level hierarchically, and we both treat each other with respect. So that's what we're looking at creating is like, I think that, you know, I would love to be able to use technology without feeling stressed or manipulated by it. I don't want to be in a war with my phone where I'm trying to disconnect because I feel manipulated by my phone, but my phone's also the most powerful tool I have. I actually just want a relationship with my phone where we feel good about it, like where it's not manipulating me into behaviors that are unhealthy for me, like where maybe the application layer could actually be something that is healthy for us, that as we do things on our phone, we could also be experiencing psychological growth. So this is what we're looking at is like, what are the design patterns for interfacing with technology that while you use it, you are also, relaxing and experiencing like insight and psychological growth and becoming a stronger and more resilient person.
Yeah. And you mentioned anxiety before, that interesting statistic that about how young people today feel greater anxiety, which is at the same time the curve of like shit that's bad in the world is generally better, right? Like there's, less deaths by war, malnutrition, and everything is going well, but it feels like the opposite curve of anxiety is going up at the same time. And
well, I think a big part of that is the climate crisis. And like, so I think the interface to the internet, and I can't speak like authoritatively on any of this. This is only gut feelings, but I think the interface to the internet is a big part of what's stressing us. I think then what we read on the internet is stressing us as well. And like an increase of fascism in the West is hard for people in the West. And then the climate crisis is hard for everyone. Like we don't know what's going to happen and we don't know how fast it's coming. And there's so much misinformation, and I think people feel pretty powerless, and feeling powerless is pretty anxiety inducing. So I think a lot of that anxiety is valid and doesn't necessarily need to be treated, but we need to figure out how to channel it. We need to figure out how to be stronger and more resilient people who can figure out how to adapt this. Like, the internet will change society in ways we can't even see yet.
Yeah.
And that happens with every new big technology. And like, we need to react to that change by learning how to leverage our anxiety and channel it into solutions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, the analogy I like to say is like, we just invented electricity and, we have no idea what a vacuum cleaner is. And it's so early days.
Yes.
So I kind of have a feeling of where you answer, but do you think the answer to the problem, is it more technology or less technology? Are the algorithms going to get sophisticated enough to be able to help us to get out of this kind of like, a monkey mind mess, or like you said, to some of the misinformation or information that you read online is like, no, you need to disconnect. You need to have like the digital detox.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is nuanced. I think that, like, until technology is different, disconnection can be a good solution, but it's not a permanent solution. It's not a long-term solution, because the trend is that we're going to be more and more connected, and the connection is useful. Like, I grew up before the internet, and I'm queer, and there was no one around me like that. And so I didn't have a community. I just had a lot of shame. And that's not a problem anymore so much because of the internet. And, these connections in many ways are very positive for us, but they're also like the way the technology is designed right now are causing problems for us. And so I don't like disconnection as a solution, because it makes us actually feel shame, because we're trying to disconnect, but we need the technology for our jobs, for, our family, for like everything that we're doing. We need to use this piece of technology. It's our alarm clock. It's everything. So then we're blaming ourselves. We're in this struggle trying to put it in the other room. Like, maybe what we can do is to start to move towards like different technology, not more or less as a solution, but some nuance around what parts of the technology are hurting us and what parts of the technology are not hurting us. And can we start to let go as a culture of the parts that are hurting us? Yeah. Can we stop making that stuff? It's
tough. It's the incentives challenge in there is just huge right now. If you just look at the current paradigm and how people generate money, it's really, really tough. But I hear your point. It's not, it's a question of different rather than more or less. What do you think is happening as a key trend that you think is underappreciated or misunderstood, that's below the radar, but you think is much more important?
So for me, it is this like tend and befriend stress response, because like, one thing I know about it is that you can choose your stress response over time through mindset and practice. And the reptilian fight or flight response, it's about zero-sum games. It's about trying to win the meeting, not collaborate, just try to like win. And the tend and befriend stress response is about, being considerate of people around you, trying to find solutions that work for everyone. And like, these are our more mammalian stress response. And I think in my opinion, it's a better stress response. Like, I don't know if you can really put a value on like that, and so, technology that encourages people to develop a mindset that is more collaborative, I think is a good thing for everyone.
Yeah. Is that what you're most excited about? Like, if you fast forward the next, let's say 5 years?
That's why I'm focusing on it for me. Like, I think like the reason that we didn't know about the potential for this interaction loop, and the reason that we didn't know that this stress response exists, is because we've mostly been studying male rats or other male animals because they don't menstruate, which like adds another variable to the data. Or we study men. And I have all of these Google News alerts, and one of them is for oxytocin, and even studies that come up for oxytocin, so often they're only studying men still this year. And so I think that like what I'm most excited about in terms of innovation in general is not any specific technology. I am pretty excited about the potential for AR, just so that I don't have to look at the internet through a tiny interface in my phone, and like hurt my neck, but like just have, see it in front of me in a more broad way. But besides AR, like I'm not so much interested in technical innovation in terms of like these big new technologies where we can have a gold rush into a new thing. I'm interested in like, what are we going to learn when we start listening to and studying more diverse voices, and what can they bring that will benefit all of us?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to close off, Brie. And thank you for your time. It was a great conversation. The final question would be, is where can people find out more about the work that you're doing and the company that you're building?
Yeah, so it's called Tru Luv, TRU space LUV, and our website is truluv.ai. And our app is available on the App Store and on Google Play. It's called #Selfcare. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play.